Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I am finally getting around to ranking all 12 of Georgette Heyer's detective novels. Georgette Heyer is best known for her Regency romances, but she did write 12 detective novels, or at least 12, that are declared as such by her estate. I had never read these books before, but, Georgette Heyer won the poll, so I decided that I would do her. And I had deliberately not read these books because I had just assumed they were in the vein of like romance novels that I don't care for. But these books are mostly very good. I enjoyed my read of these books, again, for the most part. And you should definitely give them a try. I mean, most feature either Inspector Hannayside, who is a bit of like the old fashioned detective, and his Sergeant Hemingway, who is more into the psychology. And Hemingway later becomes an inspector in his own right and works on his own. I think the most striking feature of Heyer's works here is their humor. I mean, these are very funny, often sarcastic and cynical, and they do tend to be very long. And that's probably my biggest criticism of these books. They're very long, and sometimes I feel like the plot isn't advancing as much as I would want them to. Now, there are no spoilers in this video, and before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. At number 12, the worst Georgette Heyer mystery novel was pretty clear, in my opinion. I did not consider any other book for this last spot, and that is Pen Hollow. And this book is the reason why this video is delayed for a week. It just dragged on and on and on, and it was so boring, and I struggled to get through it. It was just so boring and so long. Like, I didn't even want to read it. I was very tempted to just not finish the book, which I never not finish a book on a first read. And then I found out that Heyer very likely wrote this book to be terrible because she wanted to get out of a bad contract, which makes a lot of sense for the quality of it. Although apparently that might not be true, and like her estate claims it's not true, which, I mean, I don't know why he would be pushing back on that, even if it weren't true. And I know I'm someone who often says I don't need the murder right away, but the murder in this book happens like 300 pages into it, with the build up to it just completely uninteresting. And this is also an inverted mystery, which I don't mind at all, but the excitement of an inverted mystery is in the build up to it and seeing the events play out and the effects of the murder on the other characters and the thrill of, like, will the culprit get away with it or how they did it, and almost none of that is present here. I think there is some intrigue in the effect of the murder on the other characters, in that what the murderer thought would happen didn't happen, but by the time that happens, like, I was just simply checked out of this book to really care. And there's also just way too many characters, which is an issue Heyer often has in some of these novels, but it's especially noticeable here, where it's very difficult to get to know any of these people in particular, never mind keep track of them. The ending felt very rushed, which is a shame because that was the best part of the story. But again, when you have such a slog for the first 2/3 of the books, like, I'm not invested in the ending anymore. Like, I'm just not. And it does do the setting pretty well, but I mean, Georgette Heyer always does that, so that's not much of a plus. I'm glad this wasn't the first Heyer novel. And now that I've read it, I doubt I will ever read this book ever again. So Pen Hollow comes in at a very clear last place at number 12. At number 11 is a book I found decent. I mean, Pen Hollow is really the only bad book from Georgette Heyer, so at number 11 is fine, and that is They Found Him Dead. And I didn't really get a great sense of how many Heyer fans feel about this book, but for me personally, I think it has some issues. I mean, mainly the first chapter or two is just filled with so many characters with complicated relationships that I couldn't keep any of them straight. And they were all just thrown at me all at once. And, it kept the rest of the book from going like in any sensical way, because I kept having to think, who is this person and are they related to this person? And it was very difficult for me to keep them straight, especially since, like, especially in the first chapter, we didn't really get to know any of them particularly well, and it made me feel just completely uninterested in them. And it was sort of off-putting in a way, actually. But this book is so much better than Pen Hollow. I do think the mechanics of it are very interesting, where our first victim is shoved off a cliff, and I think some of the characters are interesting as well. I mean, Heyer always has these like really awful families that make such good characters. I particularly liked Rosemary, who has Russian blood in her, which she claims makes her greedy, which is really funny. It's not her fault she's a gold digger. And we have the first appearance of Terrible Timothy, who is a teenager here. Hannayside and Hemingway don't come into until much later, which, to be honest, is usually the case in these books, and something that did irk me a little bit, that Heyer often buried her lead detectives like this, because I liked both Hannayside and Hemingway, and I always felt like every book needed more of them. I do think there are some slow points to They Found Him Dead as well, but again, this novel does have its strong suits as well, but it's still, I did struggle with this one more than the ones above it, so I do have They Found Him Dead here at number 11. At number 10, I have the final Georgette Heyer detective novel, Detection Unlimited. And this felt like a very classic sort of Georgette Heyer with, a horrible man being murdered in a country village. This is the first one on this list that I felt had an interesting mystery to it. Lots of Hemingway in this one as well, and his focus on psychology and scolding his subordinates, which I liked. I do feel like the one-time characters, though, were a little flat for me, which is unusual for Heyer. Again, there were just too many of them, really, to get to know the ones you needed to. But I did enjoy this mystery. This is actually one of the ones that gave me some trouble in solving. I did solve it about 2/3 of the way through, before the ending was revealed, but this one kept me going for a while. But at the same time, I'm not sure I enjoyed this one as much as the ones above it. I did read these mostly in a row, so I think by the time this one came around, I was sort of like full on Heyer, so to speak, because a lot of her books are just very similar in plot and in tone. And I think by virtue of this one being last, it suffers for it. Not that I think this like is a bad book, but just because like I had read so many in a row, it sort of just had the disadvantage of being last, that I didn't enjoy it as much. I still think it's a pretty good book, though. I mean, but I simply did not enjoy it as much as the top 9, so I have it at number 10. And at number 9, this is the final one for me that I found just fine before I think they start getting really good, and that is Why Shoot a Butler? Also called Suspected with an exclamation point at the end. And I was very intrigued by this title, but I just didn't connect to the actual story. This is one of the few without Hannayside and or Hemingway, but I did find the characters here good. There aren't an overwhelming amount of them, and I felt these were much more developed than the characters from the books I've already talked about. I mean, Frank Amberley was pretty fun in the way he just like stumbles across that murdered butler in a car on his way to his uncle's house, and all of his shenanigans in trying to solve it. I did find elements of this book very good. Again, mainly the characters, which from this point forward are always excellent. Georgette Heyer really nails her characters. I would argue that is her strongest suit as a writer. It wasn't so much a problem in Why Shoot a Butler, but I do feel sometimes Heyer goes a little too much into her characters, where the scenes are delightful, but they go on a little too long without the plot moving forward. Having said that, I did find the plot a little confusing here to follow. It did not seem grounded in the storytelling. Not that it didn't make sense or it wasn't a good mystery. I guess what I'm saying is that this one felt a little bit scattered, a little bit loose. It wasn't so tight as it normally is. And I simply just like wasn't into this one as much, so I have Why Shoot a Butler here at number 9. And at number 8, we have the novel that marked Heyer's return to detective fiction after a long absence of 9 years, and that is Duplicate Death. And I think Duplicate Death has a fantastic plot, especially like mechanics-wise, that really kept me in suspense for a lot of the novel after the murder happened. Again, this one happening at a bridge party, which is always a very classic detective setting. And this was not one I solved easily or for a while. I can't really get into it without spoiling a lot of the story, but the mechanics are so enjoyable here. I wish I could put this one higher, but Duplicate Death has some issues. It is slow and slogs at points. Never for long periods of time, but long enough for it to be a problem. And I think this is one of those ones where Heyer is focusing so much on character that she neglects the plot at points. I feel like sometimes 100 pages later, the plot is in exactly the same spot it was as it was earlier. And you're always supposed to be some of the characters here, we're supposed to be rooting for just aren't likable or developed enough for me to care about. Usually everyone starts off pretty awful in these stories, but the hero goes on to become a much more sympathetic and likable figure. I did not find that here, but I do think this is in part because this is now a post World War II novel and things just aren't as happy and as cheerful as they once were. I think Heyer does an excellent job of both the time and place setting and incorporating that setting into the plot. But this book, again, it did drag in a number of places, and I did find it difficult to get enjoyment out of it, especially the amount of enjoyment I was expecting, given how much I enjoy the story. I guess this is one of those ones where I enjoy thinking about it much more than I did reading it. But I do have Duplicate Death here at number 8. At number 7, and for me, we're moving now into the tier of novels that are good. These are better than merely fine. And at number 7, I have Envious Kuska, also called A Christmas Party. And this was a very fun Christmas, country house mystery, the likes of which are plentiful in the Golden Age and very enjoyable. There was a lot of Hercule Poirot's Christmas in this novel, which is my very favorite Agatha Christie novel. And, there's a country house, an awful family, an impossible crime / locked room mystery. This was a much smaller cast of characters, and it really allowed everyone to shine and come through. I wasn't confused over familial relations and keeping track of who was who. This was a quintessential country house mystery. All the pieces are there, and because of that, it will always deliver. And I don't know how you can fail to have at least an interesting mystery in this vein if you have all of the proper pieces. And I really enjoyed the victim here, Uncle Nat, who is this elderly jerk who screams about his lumbago at the slightest convenience. And it's little character moments like that that make Georgette Heyer stand out in terms of her characterization. Now, I think there are some issues here. I mean, mainly Heyer is very heavy-handed with historical reference here, a very specific one I'm not going to mention, and she uses it as a clue. And, if you understand that, it's pretty revealing. And if you don't understand, it's sort of a waste of time. It's a waste of a clue. I personally was unfamiliar with this person, so I looked them up, but I feel as if you shouldn't have to do that. I think this is simply a product of this book being 80-ish years old by now. So perhaps it's not a great clue to be using, but I did really love Inspector Hemingway here. He and his subordinate are arguing, as always, over who the murderer is, and their argument was very similar to the one I was having with myself in my head, because I did peg the murderer fairly early on here, but I wasn't totally convinced. And I kept this discussion in my head about it, and it was so Inspector Hemingway with him being certain about it, and the sergeant is completely not seeing it. And it also took me way too long to understand the title here, which is more my fault than anything. I kept thinking it was a Latin title. I looked up Casca in Latin, which means helmet, and I was like, envious helmet. And then it did dawn on me eventually this was a reference to Julius Caesar, which makes so much sense in the long run here. But there are some flaws here, but I did mostly enjoy Envious Kuska here at number 7. At number 6 is a book I saw often listed as one of the best, and it is very good, but I did place it in the middle of the list, and that is Behold, Here's Poison, which is another great title. It's another dysfunctional family in a country house murder mystery, but this one being, to me, one of the more typical Georgette Heyer mysteries, and I mean that in a good way. It checks all the boxes of characteristics I would lay out for a Heyer mystery. I actually found the characters here better than the very similar characters from the book I have one spot above it. The Matthews family is just so outrageous, especially, Aunt Gertrude, who just randomly claims her brother Gregory was poisoned based on absolutely nothing and turns out to be correct. And she has a pretty awful daughter who keeps shoving her baby around. There's Aunt Harriet, who is very concerned about all this fish she spent money on. She talks about it constantly, and she's so unbelievably cheap. There's Stella, who can't be bothered to mourn. I actually feel like this book has a lot of commonalities with the book at number 5, and it does feel a little bit of a repeat, but I still think this book is fantastic. I think the mystery mechanics are very strong in this one, and this is one of those ones that took me quite a while to solve, to the point where I did peg the right person eventually, but I wasn't at all confident in that choice, and I didn't really solve this one outside of selecting, who done it based on some meta clues that I was fully on board with, but it was more of a hunch than anything. But the solution is extremely clever. However, I didn't really care for the romance between Stella and Randall. They are cousins, and this is something Heyer does frequently, where she has a romance, and I have to find the two people in there really shouldn't be together, and they don't make a particularly satisfying couple. And also, the feel of this book, outside of the murder mechanics, really doesn't have like a standout moment for me. So I have Behold, Here's Poison here at number 6. At number 5, the book I alluded to earlier, and that is Death in the Stalks, also called Merely Murder. And like I said, I think this novel has a lot in common with Behold, Here's Poison, despite the plots being quite different. We still have a terrible family in the Veracers, who are much smaller in size, and we don't spend a lot of time in the country village or the house which features in the story. But the Veracers' half-brother Arnold was found murdered and placed in town stocks. This is also the first appearance of Hannayside and Hemingway, whose dynamic I think is always underplayed. It does not seem, at least to me, that Heyer was all that interested in her main detective characters or the detection aspect of detective novels, which is odd. And she does focus a lot on the characters here, and for me it was a tough decision between Death in the Stocks and Behold, Here's Poison. They were very close, and they have very similar pros and cons. The reason why I have Death in the Stocks higher is because I think this one is a little more creative overall. I think this one also has the benefit of coming first, so it seems more original than Behold, Here's Poison. It also feels a lot more restrained, as if Heyer resisted the temptation to go all out and become a little much. Like, for instance, the character of Kenneth is pretty open about how much he didn't care about Arnold, and just openly talks about how and why he may have killed him, and they don't think of anything of it. I think that's probably why they have the alternate title of Merely Murder, as if it's not a big deal, but it's never over the top. It is very believable to me. Now, I don't think this book needed the second murder that happens, and I did solve this one pretty easily, but I really don't hold that against the novel unless the solution is particularly obvious. Like, I don't think it's obvious. It's just that I've read hundreds of mystery novels, probably thousands, when you combine it with short stories, that I'm just pretty good at solving these. I also didn't care for the romance that happens in the story. It felt very out of character, in my opinion, but this book is still very good, and none of the flaws hampered my enjoyment or the quality of the book. So I have Death in the Stocks at number 5. At number 4, and this book is this high because it actually did stump me, and that is A Blunt Instrument. Now, I'm not sure if this is the case in all editions. I suspect it's not, because there's a different author here, but in the edition I read, this has a little almost like Ellery Queen-esque challenge to the reader in the prologue, challenging the reader to not only solve whodunit, but what the titular blunt instrument is. And the challenge explicitly says, like, if you figure one out, you'll figure out the other. Well, I figured out the who very quickly, and I was pretty convinced what the weapon was, and I was correct about the who. I was very wrong about the instrument in question. I was also confident too, and it's not often I'm fooled nowadays, so I did like that about the book, that it tricked me. Now, this is actually a pretty short novel, for hire at least, and I think the mystery is still very enjoyable. I think Death in the Stocks and Behold, Here's Poison have better mysteries, at least stronger mysteries, but not so much so that I felt I couldn't put a blunt instrument above them. And I think A Blunt Instrument has better detection sections in it than the other higher mystery novels. This one definitely has less character focus than most, but it still has good characters. I particularly like this one because Hannayside and Hemingway are in it a lot. I do tend to think they get sidelined quite a bit, and I'm left wanting more of them. I also feel like A Blunt Instrument keeps the theme sort of a higher mystery novel while also being a little more unique in tone and feel, so I have it here at number 4. At number 3, I have a novel I frequently saw listed as the best higher novel, and while I agree it's very good, I didn't consider it for the top spot, and that is The Unfinished Clue, also called One Woman Who Knew, which is kind of a spoiler, to be honest. And this, to me, is the superior version of novels like Behold, Here's Poison, where we have, once again, a dysfunctional family filled with awful people and some friends and neighbors in a country house. However, this case, the murder has not happened when the novel begins, and that allows Heyer to characterize her victim and to set up the mystery in a suspenseful way, and allows her to demonstrate the plot mechanics in real time rather than relaying them back to us. She's very bold in how she writes the chapter right before the murder happens, where she lays out all her cards on the table, and you don't notice the clues she's put before you. She's taking a huge risk in doing this, and the characters are fantastic as always. Lola, the dancer, who is very clearly a gold digger, which is very funny to me. She just openly talks about how she's marrying the victim's son, Jeffrey, because she thinks he has money. And I think there's an element to her that's a little off-putting and icky because she's Mexican, but and it's a sort of link to her being a gold digger. But Heyer does scold the people saying that about her. It's amazing to me how Heyer can write such over-the-top characters without them becoming ridiculous and unrealistic. The plot mechanics here are excellent. The victim, General Billington, is murdered with a scrap of paper that appears to be a written clue, but it's not finished. It just says the word there, hence the title. I did think the solution was a little bit hard to swallow. Not who, but the motivation behind the murder wasn't like totally credible. It's not like it was terrible or ridiculous, but I did feel as if this was like one of those ones that has minor credibility issues, and you just have to like accept it for the sake of the mystery novel, and it is enough that I'm willing to suspend that much belief. But The Unfinished Clue here is a classic, and it finishes here at number 3. At number 2, I have the first detective novel by Georgette Heyer, and that is Footsteps in the Dark. And this one, to me, was very different than your usual Heyer novel. This is in the vein of, like, The Circular Staircase by Mary Roberts Reinhardt, or Cecily Disappears by Anthony Barclay Cox under the name R.L.R. Monmouth Plots. And I think this is better than both of those books, where the main mystery itself isn't the murder, but some kind of like odd disappearance or happening going on. In this case, alleged hauntings. There is a murder, though. Again, I do not think this book needed the murder. I'm not someone who thinks every mystery novel needs a murder, but it didn't harm the novel in any way. The Priory is a home recently inherited by 3 siblings, Margaret and her husband Charles, Margaret's brother Peter, and her sister Celia. And there's a few like village folk all warning them about the monk who allegedly haunts this estate. There's also like the spinster Anne, who I found just ridiculously funny. And of course, the supernatural elements are not real. There's a human answer to them. And I found the tone of this novel to be excellent. It's both dark, dreary, and suspenseful, but also lighthearted, often at the same time. The way the characters get frightened nearly to death are both comedic and scary at the same time. Very difficult to pull off. And this one just feels very different to me. It's very much like a ghost story combined with a murder mystery. And while the murder itself I didn't think was necessary, it was still interesting. It didn't detract from the book at all. And it's also not something you need to like solve the case. It wasn't thrown in there to make the solution easier to get to. I think Heyer demonstrates a wide variety of writing skills here. She does the gothic, the ghost story, the mystery, the humorous. She shows a wide range and skill that I don't think her other novels, as enjoyable as they are, I don't think they demonstrate that wide range. I also felt that Footsteps in the Dark didn't have those issues of Heyer being, too character focused, that the plot didn't move forward. Here, she's doing a lot of the same excellent character work while also moving the plot forward. Now, I suspect most Heyer fans probably have this one more towards like the middle of the ranking, but this, in my opinion, is so good that I have Footsteps in the Dark here at number 2. And at number 1 is a Heyer novel that I actually don't see discussed very often. I don't really know what a lot of Heyer fans think of this novel, which means to me maybe it's not as popular as I think it should be. But at number 1, I have No Wind of Blame. And I place this one at number 1 because I think No Wind of Blame demonstrates all of Georgette Heyer's strengths and none of her weaknesses. This is another country house / country village mystery novel full of awful family members, a large cast, a fantastic mystery, and mystery mechanics. And Hemingway is in this quite a bit. He doesn't actually show up until pretty late, but once he's there, he's there. He takes control. And granted, the murder mechanics, while fun and creative, are a bit convoluted and not necessarily original, but it's one that still works, and it's one that Heyer doesn't overuse. It's a little cliche, but not from her. And you can absolutely solve it, like, generally speaking. I think specifically solving it is a lot tougher. I certainly solved who, but then, I knew how it had to have happened, but the specifics of that did not come to me at all. And I absolutely adored the characters here. I mean, Ermintrude was such a ridiculous person, and her daughter Vicky just openly plays different personas and fully admits it. There's this Georgian prince who is awful and clearly a gold digger who, again, basically openly admits it. The victim in Wally is a complete jerk, but not a tyrannical one. And this is a longer novel, but it never feels it. It never drags or slogs on. The plot is constantly advancing, and I think crucially, this book has a lot of characters, but unlike some of those other Heyer novels I mentioned, this one is much easier to keep track of everyone. We're not introduced to 24 of them at the same time. Each character is allowed to develop individually. And to me, No Wind of Blame is Heyer doing Heyer at her best. Now, I will say, I think of all of these rankings I've done of different authors, I think No Wind of Blame is probably like one of the lower titles if I were to take all of the number ones and rank them. I love this book, but I don't think it stands out to me in like the grand scheme of the golden age of detective fiction. It's definitely better than like The Green Murder Case or whatever I had at number one for Miss Silver, but it just can't compete, in my opinion, with like The Unpleasantness at the Bologna Club or The Murder of Roger Ackroyd or Calamity Town or Some Buried Caesar. But still, No One to Blame is an excellent novel here. Highly recommend it. 5 out of 5 stars here at number 1. Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I am finally getting around to ranking all 12 of Georgette Heyer's detective novels. Georgette Heyer is best known for her Regency romances, but she did write 12 detective novels, or at least 12, that are declared as such by her estate. I had never read these books before, but, Georgette Heyer won the poll, so I decided that I would do her. And I had deliberately not read these books because I had just assumed they were in the vein of like romance novels that I don't care for. But these books are mostly very good. I enjoyed my read of these books, again, for the most part. And you should definitely give them a try. I mean, most feature either Inspector Hannayside, who is a bit of like the old-fashioned detective, and his Sergeant Hemingway, who is more into the psychology. And Hemingway later becomes an inspector in his own right and works on his own. I think the most striking feature of Heyer's works here is their humor. I mean, these are very funny, often sarcastic and cynical, and they do tend to be very long. And that's probably my biggest criticism of these books. They're very long, and sometimes I feel like the plot isn't advancing as much as I would want them to. Now, there are no spoilers in this video, and before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel.